Welcome. We are at the last breakout session for this afternoon. There will be a plenary at 5. Couple housekeeping items that over there you'll see a QR code. So anybody who's in the room and wants to ask a question, feel free to scan that code and you can put it in and it'll hopefully appear on the iPads. And that we will give our presenters our attention. We have people both on screen and in person, and so please be patient if for any reason there's a divide in the digital divide. So the panel will be moderated by Colin Clark, and everyone is going to introduce themselves, so I will not do a long formal introduction. But you know, this is coming after a really amazing hour with Jeff Binkley, for anybody else who was in the room then. So we are really benefiting from the opportunity to learn a little bit more and understand better the involuntary celibates and the way in which people are responding in the data and all these different pieces. So thank you for being here. Thank you all for being here. And I will let you take it from here. Colin, I think, are you starting?
Thanks so much. Yeah, great. Thanks to my fellow panelists and to everybody at the Eradicate Hate Summit. Truly saddened to not be with you in Pittsburgh, where I live, and I'm in fact in New York City. But I hope you enjoy the summit and the great city of Pittsburgh. It's my pleasure to talk with some of the leading scholars in the world on this topic of incels, which is admittedly a very sobering topic and conversation. This is, I think, in my opinion, someone that's kind of throughout my career studied Salafi jihadism and now as a director of research at the Sufan Group, looking broadly at all sorts of political and ideologically motivated violence. This is one of the most, I think, misunderstood, and I think we're going to get some great insights from our panelists today. So I don't want to belabor the point. I'd like to jump right in, and I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague and my friend Jacob Ware from Georgetown University and the Council on Foreign Relations, who's going to provide an overview of the topic. Over to you, Jacob.
Wonderful. Thank you, Colin, and thank you everyone for joining us. Those of you who are here this morning will know I gave a brief introduction to this topic in the plenary panel, so I don't want to talk too long about incel background. But let me briefly give an introduction again, just so we are clear on some of the key terms. The incel movement is a group of young men who organize it around the idea that certain physical, biological, social, mental characteristics prevent young men from having access to some kind of sexual marketplace. That marketplace is dominated, they claim, by so-called Chads and Stacys, who in turn exclude incels from participating. The result is an embittered community of male forum dwellers who perceive themselves as social outcasts and turn their ire primarily against women, but also men and romantic couples. Particularly notorious attacks linked to this movement include a stabbing, mass shooting, and vehicular attack that occurred in Isla Vista, California in 2014, a van ramming attack that occurred in Toronto in 2018, a shooting, tragically, as we just heard, at a hot yoga studio in Tallahassee, Florida in 2018, and a shooting in Plymouth in the UK last year, in which 5 people were killed. Given that we've gone over some of the background already, I thought I would frame my remarks under a question that scholars in my field, the security field, have been debating really since the incel movement first emerged around 10 years ago. Is it terrorism? Does an act of violence that targets a sorority house, for example, or a yoga studio, constitute terrorism in the way that we've typically understood it? Terrorism is generally defined as political violence perpetrated by non-state actors against civilians and designed to create some kind of broader psychological fear. And although incel violence ticks most of those boxes, there's been discussion over the political element of that definition. Is incel violence political? Is misogyny political? Is male supremacism political? Some argue that there's no clear policy being advanced. Incel violence is more about revenge. It's more about blind hate. Therefore, they would argue it shouldn't be thought of as terrorism. And presumably, it shouldn't really be a concern for counter-terrorism agencies and practitioners. I disagree a number of the incels who did turn violent left behind written or videotaped manifestos which laid out a clear ideology featuring an in-group and an out-group. Moreover, those acts of violence were frequently designed to send a message to women with sexual autonomy, of course, but also to the men by whom incels feel intimidated. There may indeed not be many coherent policy goals uniting the incel movement in a certain direction, but that doesn't mean the ideology isn't important in itself. And it doesn't mean that the violence shouldn't be thought of in similar terms as how we think of other extremist movements. Now, the jury is still out on the legal justifications for calling incel violence terrorism. This is where it's far more important. In Canada, in May 2020, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police announced a terrorism charge against an individual who had stabbed a woman to death in a massage parlor in Toronto. In a statement to police, that killer had said, "You don't choose to become an incel, you are born one." One of the key factors that complicates this kind of legal determination is that not every act has an equal dose of ideology. Elliot Rodger, who perpetrated the Isla Vista shooting, outlined his motivation in a manifesto. The individual responsible for the stabbing in Toronto, who got a terrorism charge, carried a handwritten note with him on the day of the killing. But not everyone does. An additional complication in this space is that lines between incels and adjacent extremist and violent movements are blurry. The incel ideology and community displays considerable overlap with both the more non-ideological mass shooter or school shooter, as well as the violent far right. So let me first state that the typical incel story of an alienated, lonely, sexually frustrated, angry young man who grows increasingly resentful of the world around him until he eventually takes up arms against those he felt oppressed him is not new. And I think often particularly of the video testimonies left behind by the Virginia Tech shooter who killed 32 people at that university in 2007. He said, "You had 100 billion chances and ways to have avoided today, but you decided to spill my blood. You forced me into a corner and gave me only one option. The decision was yours. Now you have blood on your hands that will never wash off." Compare that with what Elliot Rodger, the Isla Vista shooter, said in his manifesto. "Why do women behave like vicious, stupid, cruel animals who take delight in my suffering and starvation? Why do they have a perverted sexual attraction for the most brutish of men instead of gentlemen of intelligence?" Now, both of those men attacked universities. Both described being outcasts of society. It seems to me the only real difference between those two incidents is timing. Elliot Rodger's attack occurred after the movement was already organizing online, after he already had a home online. So what is new is that we have an extremist movement with a home online and a history of violence that has given a new meaning to this kind of age-old grievance and the frustration. It's harnessed that anger, it's harnessed that frustration, and it's pointed it towards an identifiable enemy. Of course, many of the incel acts of violence that we have seen, including Isla Vista, targeted schools. And I'm concerned that the incel movement risks legitimizing those attacks as forms of political resistance, in turn making them more attractive for these young men. There's also overlap with the violent far right that many other people are discussing in the panels here at this summit, particularly in the language used. Incel forums run rampant with racist language and racialized analysis of attractiveness, and also their view of feminism and of the role of women in society. Incels, like their extreme far-right brethren, argue that more progressive policies towards things like gender equality are the root of many of the globe's problems. Now, part of this anger is the product of individual loneliness, the kind of push factors that a counterterrorism scholar might point to. But the more ideological factor is their argument that society's become an oppressive matriarchy. Incels describe their ideal world as traditional, family-oriented, and they claim that efforts to empower women have actually served to oppress men. Now, this grievance has also appeared in many of the testimonies left behind by attackers we usually associate with the violent far right, because their ultimate targeting choice was more representative of white supremacist or neo-Nazi ideology. So again, the overlapping grievances and attacker profile across these groupings has complicated our ability to deduce specific motivation behind violence and therefore easy categorization of incel violence as terrorism. But 2020 and 2021 were bad years for incel violence, with several successful attacks and disrupted plots on both sides of the Atlantic. And I argue that should this movement continue to rise in prominence and violence, we would benefit from a more committed stance from law enforcement and prosecutors on incel violence as political violence. Last year at this summit, I made the argument that incels are a good case study for broader trends in modern terrorism for a number of reasons. They're young, they mobilize on social media, they organize publicly online, they often come from troubled personal backgrounds. We have a panel on that tomorrow. They attack soft targets, etc. I also made the argument that the impact of COVID on radicalization would therefore best be assessed within the incel movement, because so many of the elements that might mean COVID increases radicalization, as many scholars are concerned it will, including loneliness, boredom, too much time spent online, those things are actually part of the incel ideology itself. It's part of the grievance. I'm going to take that argument further this year to suggest that for those reasons, bold new counterterrorism measures might therefore best be tested against the incel movement. Again, it's a movement that organizes very publicly. It's very public with its grievances and its radicalization pathways. And it might be relatively straightforward, therefore, to engage in countermeasures in such forums, and then crucially, to be able to quantify their success. Now, this research is still developing. It's a very fast-moving community, and the counterterrorism research community isn't always going to have its finger right on the pulse. And for that reason, we benefit tremendously from those looking at this issue from other angles. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Colin, so we can hear from some of those other research communities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Really a lot of food for thought there. And I think, you mentioned the Virginia Tech shooter, Sung Hui Cho. I would add another name to that list, which is George Sidini. 2009 committed an attack out in Pittsburgh at an LA fitness center and chronicled a lot of the same issues that some of the other in this incel category have. But as you mentioned, we weren't thinking in these terms yet. And I think there's probably others as well. So let me pivot and please introduce Lisa Segura, who is from the University of Portsmouth. And she's going to talk to us about some of her research and what she's found. So thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Jacob, for that introduction. My name is Lisa Segura, and I'm a reader in cybercrime and gender at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. It's currently 9 o'clock here. So hello, everybody. I appreciate the afternoon where you are. As part of this sort of broader interest then in cybercrime and gender, I've been researching the incel community for over 5 years. And this research has involved myself spending time within forums, websites, basically all of the different spaces online that you can find incel behaviors. I also conducted interviews with former and current self-identifying incels. This was in order to try and understand their formation and culture. Overall, the purpose of my research was to try and understand incels' motivations and behaviors, as well as try to appreciate the evolution and spread of the incel community. Now, in this work, I take a feminist criminological approach to understanding the whole sort of motivation and ideology. Following Jacob's introduction, I think it's really imperative to highlight the fact that incel is often looked at in isolation, and we need to situate it within everyday misogyny and violence against women and girls. But also, before I go on to talk a little bit more about that, I think it's also important to highlight how there's an incel identity that is distinct from the misogynistic incel ideology and violence, because you do get women, men who are non-misogynistic and non-binary persons who identify as incel or involuntary celibate, and that their worldviews are not necessarily rooted in deep misogyny. Now, we can, of course, be critical and consider why they would still engage in these spaces that are, of course, affiliated with these very problematic behaviours. But I think that might be a conversation for another time. And certainly the ideology, the black pill, is not necessarily taken on board by every single person that engages in these spaces. And there's also evidence that not everybody who identifies as incel apportions blame onto women, feminism, or progression. So therefore, it's really important that we distinguish the incel men who are misogynist and who do dehumanize women and glorify violence. Now, according to the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, a failure to distinguish people who identify as incels or indeed involuntary celibate, including women, from those misogynist incels can lead to flawed recommendations and significant misunderstandings of the nature of this community, the prevalence of misogyny, as well as men's violence against women in our societies. But yet, going back to the point I made previously, that incels are often described in terms that present them as one-dimensional embodiment of misogyny. The ideology espoused by groups such as incels in the manosphere, however, is linked with a wider socio-political climate, and this type of extremist behaviour is not confined to online spaces, but is exacerbated and enabled by digital technologies. So whilst the internet enables the exponential replication of misogyny by inventing, spreading, and reproducing techniques to attack women, both online and offline, online misogyny is not a product of the technology, but a result of the society that has helped to shape it. So therefore, I see incels as the latest iteration against feminism and women's liberation. Whenever there has been major equality gains, and when women substantially challenge men's violence against them, there has inevitably been a backlash. So alongside empowering movements like #MeToo and other forms of feminist digital activism, which have been enabled by the digital technological age, men who feel that their privileges are being stripped away from them have also been mobilizing. Now, there's traditionally been a reluctance to tackle wider systemic misogyny by governments and name the agent of the problem in policy and legislation. It is men's violence against women, not violence passively happening to women and girls, as the term violence against women, or VOG, implies. And that ensures that the societal roots of misogyny remain intact. Incel is not the only contemporary manifestation of misogyny, of course, but yet it is almost like a convenient term for all acts of terroristic hatred against women. And we see that when often there is no evidence to link incels, or there's some tenuous evidence, or even that when there's a lone wolf, and I hate that title, but when there's something, there's an attack, the first thing people will say is it's an incel without necessarily having the evidence. And that is highly problematic when what we should be considering is obviously misogyny and male supremacism. And we're not really appreciating how this incel movement is one piece of a more expansive and insidious gender relations puzzle, which goes back to the origins of the men's rights movement back in the 1960s and the 1970s. Critiques of men's behaviour and violence against women and girls are still taken as personal attacks and countered with defensiveness and failures to hold men accountable. The defensive #NotAllMen reaction, whenever men's violence is highlighted, demonstrates how men continue to distance themselves from institutionalized power and privilege. The refusal to recognize gender inequalities enables conditions for violence. When women are not equal to men, when societal attitudes and behaviors assert male dominance over women, it allows some men to abuse women. For too long, there's been a reactive approach to misogyny, with terrible incidents such as high-profile murders of women or those incel-related attacks that evoke public interest in misogyny. Yet male supremacism has been able to flourish both on and offline, unabated and often unchallenged. Globally, women are living in terror from the threat of male violence, and incel is a contemporary digital iteration of this. So I'll pass over to somebody else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Also, like Jacob, a lot for the audience and for the panel to think about. I'm going to turn now to Yevin Wan from Moonshot. Thank you.
Yeah, hello. I'm an analyst at Moonshot. I specifically study male supremacists, but within that, I look at racial politics within male supremacist communities. So today, since the panel is on incels, I'll be speaking a little bit about incel racial ideologies and how it shapes the community as a whole. And of course, this is going with the definition that Dr. Seguria put through, that these are misogynist incels. And we are looking at men who are, like Jacob pointed out, angry at women for their inability to have sexual relations and romantic relations as well. So when we look at race broadly, there are sometimes this it's perpetuating misconception that the vast majority of incels are white. This simply isn't true. When we look at the demographics of incels, as well as self-reported data that they occasionally collect amongst themselves for their demographic purposes, we do see that race has an incredible diversity within the so-called inceldom, a digital manifestations of many in the generally male supremacist digital spheres. And so I wanted to talk about 3 reasons why race shapes so much of incel ideology as well as incel activities. And I learned this term a month ago, this is a hill I will die on, and the fact that race has a central role in incel ideology as well as how incels perceive the role is the hill that I think as a researcher I will die on. The first reason I think that race is so central to inceldom is the fact that incel ideology features incredibly racialized understandings of the world. The incel racial hierarchy is based on masculine sexual desire, or desirability rather. So it upholds a lot of white supremacist, white hegemonic ideals. So we have the white incels on top. And then at the very bottom, people kind of go back and forth about who should be on the which rung in the middle. At the very bottom, we usually have Asian incels. They are considered profoundly demasculized and desexualized. And so what happens there is that if this racial hierarchy is presumed to be a biologically immutable fact, kind of how race is understood by white supremacists and how gender is understood by male supremacists, then it profoundly shapes how incels organize themselves as well as target women of different races. So the first thing we look at, or really I was researching, was how Asian incels group together. So because they believe that they're at the very bottom rung of the racial hierarchy, we see many Asian incels coming together, calling themselves rice cells or curry cells, depending on whether they were East or South Asian descent, and coming together in this shared racial identity to discuss and bemoan together how they perceive both real and imagined racial disparities. And it's very, very interesting because, or rather horrific, the JBW theory, or the just be white theory, is a very salient ideology in the incel sphere. The just be white theory suggests that white men will always have access to women of all races. So it's white supremacy articulated in a very male supremacist way. And incels of color have really latched onto that, and that really shapes a core of their grievance, which is the second point that I wanted to make, which is that race shapes incel grievance a lot of times. And incels of color latch onto that, and they say, there's no way that I can escape this predicament because of my race, and they kind of band together and talk to one another on that issue. But sometimes we see incels of mixed race, partly European heritage, or white incels, who also latch onto the GBW theory to express their own grievance. So I'm often loath to quote directly from perpetrators, but this seemed very relevant in the context that we were speaking. Elliot Rodger, arguably one of the most famous incel attackers, in his manifesto, wrote he was in a house party and he saw an Asian man speaking with a white woman. And he wrote, "How could an ugly Asian attract the attention of a white girl while a beautiful Eurasian like myself never had any attention from them?" So he is not quoting JBW theory directly, but that quote in itself has been circulated amongst lots of white incels as well as incels of part white heritage to talk about how JBW theory affects, or rather fails, them in some ways. And so when grievance is shaped in racialized terms, the third thing that we see is that it also shapes how they characterize, discuss, and harass women of different races. So when we look at how incels talk about women, we see that a lot of the differences are not just in terms of socioeconomic status or what they do, but in really horrifically racialized terms. So misogynoir, which is misogyny directed at Black women, is incredibly vitriolic. Racism against Asian women using fetishization and hypersexualization of Asian bodies really is very prominent. So one of the key incel terminology, Southeast Asian maxing, refers to the act of a white man, usually in this context a white incel, traveling to Southeast Asian countries in search for sex tourism. And for some incels, that is a way to escape their incel condition, so to speak. And so white incels would use that as hope fuel or things that give them a chance to look forward to. Whereas incels of color, especially Asian incels, would use that as a way to cope fuel or rage fuel, where they talk about how this, impacts them differently. So one way or another, we're talking about the very coarse way in which they characterize and demean Asian women. And finally, white women are also talked about in incredibly demeaning ways, mostly in the way that they are considered to be the forebearers of the progressive movement or the feminist movement, and that the desirability of white women have somehow degraded because of their involvement, supposedly, in the feminist movement, supposedly denoting the fact that this is a broad generalization and that women of color also participate in the feminist movement as well. So all of this put together, it is incredibly difficult to not only assess the threat of incel violence, but also understand how incels see themselves in this community and organize around certain salient identities outside of their masculine identity. Those are all incredibly important things that we have to keep in mind as we try to go forward and study the deeper nuances and ideologies of the incel community. I wanted to end with the fact, as in most bigoted, hateful communities, anti-Semitism is rampant. In a recent Mujat report, we saw that the Great Replacement theory had incredible traction in this community, where Jewish people were blamed for supposedly creating miscegenation and interracial relationships. Women were branded as race traitors. And so when you look at that more broadly, you see how integral race really is to incel understanding of the world.
Thank you very much. Really, I think, sobering look at a very understudied aspect within inceldom more broadly, which are racial relations. I'm going to turn now to Patrick James from Meta, and he's going to give us the tech angle. Please.
Thanks, Colin. So I am Patrick, coming to you from Meta. I'm on the Dangerous Organizations and Individuals Policy team. Before joining Meta, I got my start as a researcher at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, otherwise known as START, at the University of Maryland. I bring that up because while I was at START, I was a project manager who got to see through thousands of examples how radicalization can unfold. And I'm not going to surprise anybody here by saying after 6 years, I didn't find the pathway. I didn't find the magical list of indicators. What I did find is that radicalization, generally speaking, of course, has been going on. Our data went back to 1970s, but way before then. Through, I left in 2019, and that, of course, radicalization occurred before the advent of the internet, and I think we do need to be very clear about some of the ways that the internet does play into the radicalization process. But I don't have a ton of time, so I did want to make 3 points while I'm here. The first point is going to outline how radicalization, of course, is a very complex process. involving, in my view, a overlapping set of causal drivers. And they can be emotional drivers, material drivers, social drivers, psychological drivers that combine in idiosyncratic ways and produce outcomes that are hard to predict. Further complicating this, of course, is that ideology is not necessarily a driver of behavior, and behavior is not necessarily a driver of ideology. These things happen in nonlinear ways. And so when you throw this on the internet, of course, it makes everything much more complicated and even harder to study. So from a perspective of being somebody who's been in the tech industry for 3 years, I kind of sit at the nexus of policy and what we call scaled enforcement. So how to use tools, how to use content moderation to scale that enforcement out across the platforms as big as Facebook and Instagram. I think it's useful to contextualize the role that online platforms play in some concrete examples. I bring to you today, the spread of extremist content is one. The formation of extremist communities on our platforms, echo chambers, and the amplification and recommendation of those two. So amplification of content and recommendation, amplification of communities. So I don't see social media or the internet as a cause, but we have to be very clear in the ways that these platforms, including Meta and Facebook and Instagram, play a role. I'm not going to also pretend to be an incel expert like my co-panelists here. I specialize mainly in sort of white supremacist spaces, but of course there is a ton of overlap with what we see in the incel movement, generally speaking, in white supremacy. But the second point I want to make is that for something like the incel movement and how tech platforms deal with it, there is no one-size-fits-all policy solution. There is no magic policy button we can press. The harms that are manifested and that emanate from the incel movement are multifaceted. And for tech companies, the best way that we have to mitigate some of those harms are going to be a overlapping set of policies. Hate speech, of course, is probably the most prominent, talking about incel ideology and manifestation. Violence and incitement in the ways that adherents will actually call for violence or coordinate harm. Bullying and harassment, I think, is a really big sort of understudied component of this. The release of, related to harassment, the release of personally identifiable information, which is also a policy we have at Meta. Suicide and self-injury. Lisa mentioned earlier, of course, there's a very wide range of those who involve or who sort of identify with the incel label. And only, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the tip of the iceberg are going to be the ones that actually manifest violence. But I think there are a lot of other underlying dynamics at play. And then my area, dangerous organizations and individuals, is where we see that manifestation of violence in horrible ways. Elliot Rodger, of course, is the prime example, but there are several others. So you see an overlapping sort of mosaic of policies that we can use to address the incel movement. We're not going to likely pass a policy against limiting about the inability to gain a sexual partner, but I think there are more concrete ways that we can frame that discussion. Which brings me to my third point is that we are not perfect. We can develop policies, we can scale out enforcement, we can develop classifiers and advanced algorithms to detect this content, but we can't moderate ourselves out of this problem. And as long as these communities exist in society, they will exist on the internet. And that I think it's really important to consider whenever we are making these enforcement decisions at a place like Meta, of course, there's going to be a trade-off. in how you approach the enforcement. You can, the more nuanced a problem is, the more difficult it is to scale that out. Classifiers that detect content and in some cases automatically enforce on content is fed and driven by human decisions that are aggregated over time. And so part of the problem is that from a policy perspective, you have to decide how aggressive you want to be with each sort of automated decision. And I see it as a kind of a sliding scale. You can be really impactful in terms of scaled enforcement, but you're going to perhaps lose a bit of nuance, or you can scale that back and have a lot of nuance built into the policy, but you're going to have a hard time scaling that out. This is all, of course, made more complicated by we're trying to hit a moving target, because these are dynamics and communities and things that evolve in real time. The incel community is this decentralized, amorphous, sort of overlapping set of ideologies and communities and forums that embrace satire and memes and constantly evolve their language. And so trying to hit a moving target and calibrate that at scale is a challenge that we are dealing with every day. So I will end with that. I will pass it back to Colin, and I suppose we'll now have Q&A.
Thanks so much, Patrick. I really appreciate it. And I think, I certainly do, and the audience likely does have a greater appreciation for the challenges that you guys are dealing with on a regular basis. It's easy to criticize, I think, tech companies and say they should be doing more, but until you understand the nuances that undergird a lot of these policy decisions, again, that's all it is, criticizing without offering an alternative. I have, one or two questions I'd like to throw out to the panel. I don't have anyone specifically in mind for this first question, so whoever feels like they want to jump in, multiple people do, that's great. Really, every speaker touched upon this in one way or another, and I guess my question is, where do incels fit within the broader far right? I've heard people describe, and I'm not sure I agree with this, as inceldom as a conveyor belt or pathway to the far right. And I've also heard people say, well, for your traditional white supremacists and neo-Nazis, they don't want to kind of incorporate incels because they're looked at as pathetic or lame or desperate, right? They're kind of not that manly image that, a lot of skinheads or neo-Nazis will try to project. So my broad question is, where do incels fit within the broader far right? Are they part of the spectrum? Do they come to racist ideas after incel ideas? How does it all work? Maybe we'll start with Jacob, and then if others want to jump in, they can.
Sure, thank you, Colin. I'm happy to touch on this, but let me be clear, my thinking on this issue is informed by, mostly actually by the stuff I've read from kind of more feminist scholarship circles. So I'm curious to hear what Lisa and Yebin also have to say about this. The best description I ever saw of the overlap with the far right is obviously, as I mentioned, there's racialized language, racialized analysis within the incel community. But the best and most nuanced analysis I ever saw was from a scholar called Cass Mudder, who's a scholar of the far right. He explained how the way that the far right has evolved over the years in terms of its views on women is a transition from a benevolent sexism, which was based on a whole bunch of white men in organizations like the KKK arguing that their role was to protect white women and to allow white women to rear white children. Those of you who study the far right might know of a famous creed that exists in the far right called the 14 Words, which says we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. And that's all about that benevolent sexism, making sure that white women are protected in order to continue the white race. The way that shifted in more of an online kind of environment is we're seeing the rise of something that he calls hostile sexism, where instead of being a community that's protected at all costs, women have now become a legitimate target of political violence. And I think the incel violence the incel community has played a big role in that mental shift from women being kind of revered and, as I said, protected, to women and feminism being a legitimate enemy that can now be targeted as part of ideological and, as I said, political violence, therefore terrorism. That's kind of how I think of it. Curious to hear anything from Lisa or Yevin, or also Patrick, of course.
Thank you. Yeah, Lisa, any thoughts, or Yevin? I find the term benevolent sexism almost an oxymoron in many ways, but the way you described it is accurate in that kind of transition and evolution. Yeah, Lisa, please, if you have thoughts. If not, we can go to Yevin.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I pretty much agree to some extent with what Jacob said, and I think the point that you said as well. Well, you've kind of alluded that you're not really on board with that kind of conveyor belt from incel to the far right, and that's not something that was immediately evident in the research that I did, and certainly not with the interviews that I undertook with people who are self-identified as incel. I think we need to obviously appreciate that a lot of it is performative, and obviously incels as a movement, they're keen to present themselves as apolitical or not aligned with any political party. But of course that suits their purpose as well. So then they try and evade that connection being made. I mean, obviously this is political, as Carol Hamish said. The personal is political. They wanting to completely infringe on 1% of the world's population's lives. So therefore, this is definitely political, even if they don't necessarily align with the left or the right. But yeah, that whole discussion around benevolent sexism and things. I mean, I think too often, I think there's that kind of misunderstanding or conflation of what the difference between sexism and misogyny is. The sexism is seen as often as harmless, and it kind of plays into the incel rhetoric of this is satire, this is just a joke, or women don't get the humor, about rape jokes and things. Oh, lo and behold. But actually, it's sexism is supporting those structures, those patriarchal, misogynistic structures, and then misogyny is actually, enforcing that hate as well. So I think it's that continuum as well. So I think for me, I just would have those concerns that when we're talking about sexism, that we're not seeing it as part of the broader issue here as well. And it's all it's just supporting and reinforcing and validating those structures.
Yeah, some really important clarifications there, I think, and the more we can be precise with our language, the better we'll be able to understand this. Yevin, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I don't know if I correctly understood, but I think it is definitely something that I've heard a lot when I'm doing incel research. Is a lot of people would approach me and ask, is violent misogyny a gateway into white supremacy, or a gateway into other violent far-right ideologies that we may be more accustomed to hearing on the news or discussed amongst ourselves? And the implication that it draws is that, kind of like how we would discuss other elements of gateways, is that violent misogyny in itself, in its purest form, is not severe enough, that it is always a stepping stone to a more severe ideology. And that concerns me deeply, not just as a scholar of incels as well as male supremacism, but that, and I think this is why we wanted to, for this conference, use the term male supremacism. Just like when we use racism and describe white supremacy as a type of white racism that is most, salient in our community and most destructive at the moment, male supremacism and the patriarchal, society that it derives from is, we want to really articulate and put the onus of the blame on male supremacy. It's not just sexism, it's male supremacy. And when we talk of it as a conveyor or a gateway into something more sinister, it, I think, would help us as a community to step back and say, but isn't male supremacy severe on its own? Isn't the safety and rights of women and girls severe on its own? And I think a lot of you working here on the internet and just far-right ideologies in general, a lot of the times these days, I think I see on the internet as well, is the convergence of misogyny and things like homophobia and transphobia. So who gets to be a woman? Who gets to be a girl? And when trans rights, especially trans women's rights, are threatened in that manner, then this is not just a binary of man, woman that male supremacists really hold dear. We have to expand the conversation and say, but isn't this severe enough? And isn't this a distinct extremist ideology that deserves attention and investment from our lawmakers and ordinary citizens? I think that's the key here and why I'm really motivated to study, even though it can be pretty horrific 99% of the time.
Yeah, well said. Patrick, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in on that. If not, I've got a follow-up question.
I have just one small point to make, and I think
Please.
I'll pick my narrow lane here, and I'll say that one sort of common touch point that we see whenever sort of inceldom and violent misogyny erupts into acts of violence is those acts of violence are often looked at by non-incels as sort of, it's still celebrated because to many sort of white supremacist communities, violence is the end into itself. And so I think it's still celebrated and looked to as an example, even if there isn't this sort of conveyor belt, which is also something that I reject. But the act of violence and then the sharing of any sort of tactical information, tactical learning, I think needs to also be kind of taken into consideration.
I think, what stuck with me is just this very legitimate point that you made, Yevon, which is, isn't male supremacy severe on its own? Right? Why does this need to be connected to something more nefarious or equally nefarious? And it leads me back to a question I was thinking about earlier when Lisa first gave her remarks in the initial round, and that is, why is there such a reluctance by governments to tackle misogyny? And if you had a magic wand and were able to implement a public policy, or just give advice to governments that maybe are listening right now, how do you begin thinking about this and moving towards something that begins resembling, a solution or a mitigating measure?
So first of all, yeah, you've asked me the really hard question there. I mean, why? I mean, I think if I knew why, then it'd be much easier to try and obviously, detangle that. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, first of all, name the problem. Too often, gender or misogyny is not included in so many, in so much policy and legislation. I'll give you an example. Here in the UK, we've got the Online Safety Bill, which is currently being implemented. And the evidence shows that disproportionately women and girls and persons from marginalised communities that are most at risk of harassment and abuse online, and that is not taken into consideration within that legislation. The problem is not explicitly stated. So first of all, I think that's a starting point, is to name gender. I think in terms of and also just things like gender impact assessments, when I think when new tech is being designed, things like that. I think in terms of addressing the very real problem, it's about appreciating that this form of male supremacist extremism exists on that continuum of abuse and violence against women and gender-based harassment and violence. And so therefore it's about addressing so not just thinking about de-radicalization problems, but learning from other approaches and initiatives that are tackling gender-based abuses. So recognizing the importance of things like domestic abuse perpetrator programs as well, because this is about it's about deconstructing, well, not even deconstructing, but it's about completely countering conditioned attitudes towards women and about gender and things, and that needs to be completely tackled rather than just violence, for example.
Yeah, really well said. We've probably got a couple more minutes left. Do we have any questions coming in from the iPad at all, Jacob?
Not yet, so we can take one more from you.
Well, I'll take the moderator's preference then, and and ask another one. And that, so, as a student of terrorism, and someone that's looked at, various forms and ideologies and all of these different things that motivate political violence, a group like the Phineas Priesthood, that in the past has been known to target interracial couples. I think very often we look at these problems as if they're new, right? For the first time, we're seeing something that's totally new and we have a new name and we know what to call it. But I wonder about the legacy of a lot of kind of violent ideologies that have really just been repackaged, repurposed. And maybe this is a question best suited for Patrick or for others. I'm just wondering, do you think the internet gives extra mileage to these types of folks that want to kind of take this concept and market it, right? You look at the aesthetics, you look at the slang that's used, you look at various kind of hashtags or memes. How does that kind of breathe new life into old ideologies and make them relevant again, and allow some of these groups or networks to recruit?
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, you just described some of the problems that are starting to, give me gray hairs. So,
Join the
Jacob
club, my friend.
Yeah, Jacob mentioned earlier, the 14 words, which is a racist creed developed by David Lane in the 1970s. And 50 years later, here we are still seeing the same, 1488, 14 words type content being recycled into memes. It gets even more complicated when you have to consider the ever-evolving set of mediums that this content could be manifest in. So first text-based content, and then visual, sort of like static photos, and now, over the past couple of years, video, audio, and now new technologies like AR, VR, and the metaverse. This type of content, as long as it exists in society, unfortunately, is going to continue to find a way to worm itself into online platforms. And so, my team, we have to be very agile in the way that we approach the content. But at the end of the day, a content-only solution is never going to get us where we want to be. And so we have to look at networks of actors. We've found that sort of bulk removal of harmful networks, especially when they're sort of engaging in coordinated violating behavior, taking a network all out at once has been a very effective way to both remove those harmful actors and prevent the proliferation of harmful content, as well as looking at behavioral signals. But, the sad part is that none of these ideas are really all that new. They are being repackaged. New language evolves. And some evolutions happen as quickly as overnight. With Boogaloo, for example, I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but they were changing their language literally within hours after we would do a takedown. And so it's whenever we act as a tech platform, adversarial actors learn from that, and they also learn from each other. So no real good answers for you, Colin, but it is extremely complicated and it keeps us busy.
Who could forget the big igloo?
Yeah.
Fun times.
Can I say really quickly that I do
Please.
think that there were some questions from the audience that I don't think the iPad was working. And so we only have a few more minutes, but if somebody has one really pressing question, because I saw a few people taking pictures of the scan, is it okay with you if we take one question from the audience since the iPad wasn't working?
Please.
Absolutely.
Okay, go ahead.
So I have this question about incels of the manosphere. It is often used as interchangeable, and we're also often giving incels a monopoly on misogyny. So I'm wondering your thoughts about this, how to distinguish incels from the manosphere, and not forgetting that the violent misogyny
Can you guys hear it? Did you hear that? Okay.
Outstations are unable to hear, so if someone on the panel could repeat the question, unless that was more of a comment than a question.
The general gist of the question, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it was that incels and the manosphere are often used erroneously interchangeably, and that incels seem to have, in the media as well as our attention, monopoly on violent misogyny, even though they are not the full picture. So how do we clearly differentiate and actually do what's right? Actually, Dr. Seguria wrote a book on this. So I feel that with the expert in the house, she would be best suited to answer that question.
Yeah, so I think, well, obviously started is the use of the correct terminology as well, and making sure we differentiate between the different groups of the manosphere for starters. And I made the point that incel is not homogenous, but that's not to say that the ideology is unproblematic, because obviously it isn't. But it's about obviously not doing the default thing and thinking that every single act of male supremacist terrorism is actually incel related as well, until we actually have more evidence. And I appreciate that often that we might never get, complete evidence. It's easier if there's a manifesto left behind or a post or something, and even then, we know that others could post that, and we need to be mindful, that obviously the validity of that. But I think for me, it's obviously naming this problem, that regardless of specific motivation, what is the common denominator is that we're talking about male supremacism and the broader context of violence against women and girls. And so I think it's about not losing sight of that, and certainly not going down that sensationalist route then of just becoming consumed with everything that is incel without appreciating that broader context.
Can I just jump in quickly, Colin, just to say Yebin will be speaking tomorrow on a panel on this topic, where I think that the panel is called Beyond Incels, the Broader Threat from the Manosphere. So do come back if that's a question that interests you. Yebin's going to kind of unpack some of those wonderful movements for us. So over to you, Colin.
No, I just want to thank all the panelists for really, really, deep insights and rich conversation on a fairly fraught topic that is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. And I think we're all a lot smarter, I can certainly say, for having listened to these experts. So thank you very much for your time and your expertise. Thanks again to the organizers of the Eradicate Hate Summit, and look forward to more discussions. So thanks so much.
Thank you.